for my last birthday. That means I know we are starting right on time to the second. And I want to do that because we have a fabulous panel this morning for, I think, one of the most important topics in energy economics, which is how does the electric utility sector survive and thrive as a business as well as a critical public service going into a new century with many major changes buffeting that sector from various perspectives. My name is John Jimison. My day job is as the managing director of a group in Washington, D.C. called the Energy Future Coalition. And looking at the future, we see major changes in a sector that in the 20th century, the National Academy of Engineers in Washington decided was the greatest engineering achievement of the 20th century was the creation of the North American electric grid. And now going into the 21st century, we see many ways in which that achievement will be changing. The key factors that I think are pushing and pulling on the electric utility sector are first a suite of new technologies that are actually somewhat belatedly bringing the magic of digital controls, data processing, monitoring, and programming to the sector that provides what it is that allows computers to run in the first place. But the electricity sector, going through what's some called a smart grid revolution, is becoming computerized. But it's not merely the digital controls and technology that is providing a new technological change of environment to the power sector. We have, for the first time, electricity storage technologies moving into commercial space. And electricity was always famous for something that moved at the speed of light and could not be stored effectively. We have generation technologies that are proliferating invasive species to a certain extent in a sector that has traditionally relied on fossil fuel-fired power generation and on hydro generation, then went into the nuclear era, but still steam cycle generation, but now including increasingly solar power from photovoltaics, wind power, energy from biofuels and other sources. And the whole array of technology is changing, and it's not just on the utility side of the meter, but very importantly, many of these technologies are penetrating on the customer's side of the revenue meter. So that has created another major force of change for the utility industry, which is in its competitive environment, where as a natural monopoly public service under the regulation of the state or of local communities, the utility industry has traditionally had little or no competition for most of its services. And now the customers themselves are increasingly gaining the ability to compete with their utility suppliers with generation and with the ability to, for the first time, participate in the price setting process by responding to price signals in the electricity market, as opposed to the classic sense of being passive consumers of electricity who are simply notified months later or weeks later how much they used and what they owe them. But in addition to the competition from customers, there is a phalanx of third-party entrepreneurs who see enormous business opportunities for themselves and for the economy as a whole in this sector, and they have increasingly been active. And then electricity is, how would I say it, the principal way in which we use energy. Many people don't realize that the direct use of energy by consumers in the United States peaked in 1973. Since then, our direct use as consumers in the residential, industrial, and commercial sectors has been flat or declining. But our energy use has gone up because we use energy indirectly, using electricity directly, and the primary fuel use has gone up to generate that electricity. And our economy continues to be electrified and computerized, and electricity is only becoming more important over time as a result of that. And that puts greater pressure on the health and the functioning of the industry that provides that service. So for the utilities themselves, the pressure is huge because of efficiency, better lighting, motors. Every way we use electricity, we're becoming more efficient. We are actually not using more electricity now, and going into the future are projected to use less than 1% growth per year in the US of electricity, and many people think that demand will fall. At the same time, huge investments are needed to protect the reliability of the system in the face of both natural and man-made intrusions, and to make the needed investments to integrate the suite of new technologies and to incorporate it, and to gain the management and benefits of those technologies. So we have a changing environment and an industry that is still regulated very much as it was originally. And New York is the perfect place to look at this question, not just because it was just 2 or 3 miles down that way when Thomas Edison built the first electric utility at the Pearl Street station and sold electricity commercially on Manhattan Island, along with steam, by the way. But because New York experienced a year ago, in October 2012, one of the greatest natural disasters in terms of reliability, Superstorm Sandy, flooding out huge areas of the city and causing long-lasting power outages and bringing to everyone's mind how critical it is that we maintain reliable service of electricity. But then in addition to that, New York has now become the epicenter of regulatory thinking about how to change the regulatory structure and the service model of the utilities and their compensation scheme. The New York Public Service Commission has launched a proceeding called Reviewing Our Energy Vision, or Reforming Our Energy Vision, REV, which intends by the end of the year to develop and adopt a new business model for New York's electric utilities. So this is the perfect place. It's a critically important topic, and it's a topic that really calls out for the skills of energy economists to help people understand and move forward in how do you take this critical industry, the most important of direct energy services to an advanced economy, and change its business model, what it gets paid for and how it gets paid for what it does, in a way that preserves the strength and allows that industry to continue to attract low-cost capital for the huge investments it has to make, while maintaining the reliability of that service, and in the face of a much more competitive environment, and oh, by the way, the need to decarbonize the production side. So to address this question, we're lucky to have a wonderful panel of experts. And I'm going to introduce them briefly. Their full bios are on the website, and I certainly encourage you to review them afterwards if you haven't beforehand, so you can realize how important what you just heard was. First, on my left is Ralph Izzo, and Ralph is the chairman and CEO of the Public Service Enterprise Group, which is a major investor-owned utility group based in New Jersey. And so he's a next-door neighbor, but now, in the wake of Hurricane Sandy, Ralph's utility, PSE&G, did such a fabulous job of responding to that catastrophe that they were basically asked to take over Long Island Lighting Company, which didn't do such a fabulous job, and manage that. So he's got people working hard in Long Island trying to restore the reliability of that system, and that gives him a big stake in the New York process going forward as well. But Ralph is known as one of the thought leaders of the utility industry on these topics. A very articulate and erudite person who started out as a plasma fusion scientist in Princeton. So you know he knows how to deal with long-term efforts that will take a long time paying off. Next to Ralph is Jigar Shah. And Jigar is, I think, the pioneering entrepreneur in this sector. This is the man who had the idea that you could put solar panels on people's roofs with capital other than the people whose roofs those were, and not only make it a paying proposition for the company, but for the people that, for the, essentially the owners of the roofs, and bring vastly more solar energy into the system. But Jigar is a much broader thinker than simply a business person who had a great idea and built Sun Edison, in his case, a wonderful company. He was executive director of the Carbon War Room, which is focusing on how we deal with the climate change challenge from a business perspective globally. He has written a book called Creating Climate Wealth, in which his thesis is that there are huge business opportunities in clean energy, business opportunities that don't depend on government subsidies, and that are really a critical way forward if we're going to deal with the climate problem. And so I think it would be hard to find anyone who could better represent the potential competitive vectors of third-party entrepreneurial entry into the regulated utility space. Then we have David Newberry. And David, of course, is the immediate past president of this association. But David is a emeritus professor of economics at Cambridge and a research fellow of the Control and Power Research Group, and was a principal advisor to the House of Commons Select Committee on Climate Change, and also to the Dutch on utility business model issues. And so he certainly has, I think probably as much as anyone, applied the discipline of energy economics to the question of how electric utility sector moves from what it is to what it needs to be. And then finally, Michel Derfay is the Secretary General of ERDF, and I'm not sure what the French is, but it's basically the French electricity distribution system. And he worked with Électricité de France for many years. But he is also the author of a number of publications on the energy future, and has lectured at the Paris Institute of Political Studies on this question of how electric utilities evolve going forward in the face of all the challenges that I've met. So now I've talked long enough that we've got the rest of the audience in the room, and I'm very appreciative that you're all here, and I can turn it over to the people you came to hear. So with that, what we're going to do is go through the speakers in the order listed in the program, in the order I've introduced them. Then we will, as normal, take questions from the audience, and look forward to a really good discussion of an important topic. Thank you.
My hope is to leave you with 4 thoughts this morning. The first 3 being the aspects of energy industry that I think about most, resulting in a business model that I'd like to see us move toward. The first aspect is one that was already described, but I want to re-emphasize it just because it's such an interesting consumer dynamic. That being that our customers are becoming increasingly dependent upon electricity. This was manifested most clearly during Superstorm Sandy, which occurred now 15 months ago. And the number of stories that one can tell over that 2-week experience would be almost infinite. But I'll bracket it with 2 in terms of customers' dependence upon electricity. Literally one day while in the control room, the command center trying to restore power, a colleague of mine received a phone call from a physician, actually a heart surgeon in a nearby hospital, saying that they were on a 2nd day of backup power. He had 2 open heart surgeries planned for that day, and he was a little apprehensive about doing it on backup power. Would we have them restored? And of course, they were a prioritized customer. They were in the queue to be restored that day, and we did get them restored before those surgeries were conducted. A few days later, I received an email from a stay-at-home parent saying that if we did not turn her electricity on by that day, her teenager was coming to live with me because she was at her wit's end with that individual. So, the stories, most of them were somewhere in between, but the ability for folks to live without electricity varies quite a bit depending upon the circumstances. What's particularly interesting about that is, as was mentioned, while people are valuing electricity more than they ever did before because of the increased electrification of their lifestyles, they're using less of it. We actually saw a 1.7% weather normalized decrease in electricity being used by customers last year. And what that means simply is as we use more electricity in our mobile gadgets, the increase there is not enough to offset the decrease associated with the replacement of our refrigerator after its 15 years, or our air conditioning system after 20 years, and the efficiency gains that have been made in those major energy consumption devices. So normally when a product is more highly valued, people are willing to pay more for it, and the need for increased reliability, and in fact we now use the term resiliency to speak about the ability of the system to withstand the kind of storms that we're seeing with increased frequency. The ability to provide that increased reliability and resiliency really imposes some increased costs on the customer base. And if the revenue that we recover is the numerator and the throughput is the denominator, because that's the way in which we price this product, what you can see is the rate for the electricity is going up. Normally, once again, if a consumer values a product, they don't mind paying more for it. But the value that consumers place on electricity is very much an implicit value. No one, not even yours truly, wakes up in the morning and says, I want to use more electricity today. I might wake up and say, I can't wait to turn on ESPN to see the World Cup match. I might wake up and say, I can't wait to host a few guests and run the air conditioner for dinner this evening. But the electricity is sort of behind that value that's quite explicit, namely the entertainment or whatever the device is that's making use of electricity. So the ability of regulators to pass along to consumers the rate increases associated with declining use but increased dependence is quite a challenge. So that's issue number one, changing consumer dynamic. Issue number two is a long-standing and appropriate one as well, which is our increased desire to have greater and greater environmental protection. Those of us who have a technical background remember the days when combustion, in its perfect form, resulted in a hydrocarbon combined with oxygen to produce water and CO2. And we describe CO2 as the bubbles in your soda pop. And now, of course, it's a forerunner of the demise of the planet as we know it. So the world has changed for those of us who have a more of a technical bias from when we first learned about combustion. In fact, I'm not denigrating that at all. It's something that we need to step up to in terms of the climate change challenges that we face, in particular in the carbon-constrained future. That just adds to the issues that confront us in the more traditional pollutants of SO2, NOx, mercury, hazardous air emissions, etc. Most of that appears to be affecting the supply side of our business and less so on the delivery side. However, those demands on the supply side are resulting in some alternative options being pursued that have both utility scale implications as well as distributed scale implications, primarily renewables. So in addition to the change in consumer behavior and the change in environmental pressures, the increase in environmental pressures, the third area I'll mention is just that, the evolution of improvements in technology that are taking some larger scale tech options for energy services and making them more accessible to consumers at the distributed level, be that rooftop solar or smart thermostats. Now, if I look at those three forces and I ask myself, what is an appropriate role for the utility? My answer is a very simple one. As someone who's responsible for ensuring that the shareholder achieves the return that they expect for the capital they entrust us with, I would like to be indifferent to the solution I choose to provide an outcome to the customer that is an optimization of meeting environmental demands, providing electricity safely and reliably and at the lowest possible cost to them. So whether that means I invest in a 500 kilovolt power line or compact fluorescent bulbs or a smart thermostat, my shareholder should be indifferent to that. And the only thing I should be worried about is how do I optimize that outcome for my customers. That's not the case today. Today I am far better off acting in my shareholders' interests if I do not invest in a thermostat and instead I make my desk bigger. Because my desk would be a capital asset that people want to rate base. And yet the smart thermostat it's not a service I'm allowed to provide. And the piece that I wish to make with the technology community and the entrepreneurial community that is cleverly bringing about these opportunities is that I would like to be their most effective sales channel. I would like to be their market maker. Because at the end of the day, not only do I not manufacture the components for my nuclear plant, but I have no expectations of manufacturing the light bulbs or the smart technology or developing the computer applications to manage the home. I am a service provider. And I think that the number one reason why that can work, first of all, it need not be at the exclusion of the entrepreneurial community's desire to penetrate those markets. It could be in addition to. But one of the hallmarks of the utility industry, be that the water utility industry, the gas utility industry, or the electric utility industry, is universal access to service. And I do fear that with the current explosion of technology and the regulatory regimes that we're setting up to encourage that we're setting up a fairly regressive system. Many of the systems, many of the programs that we have in the states are such that the subsidies flow from all taxpayers to those with a disposable income to make the investments, be that in the supply options or the demand options. And typically those are high disposable income individuals. And these are all the programs that I'm familiar with in the states in which we operate. One can actually do the diagnostic and see who is applying for the grants and see if these are generally higher income individuals. And the subsidies come from the taxpayers. So we are at a very low level. I grant you this is not something that's pervasive, but we are creating a system that is counter to what I believe we would like to see as a society, and the access to high energy efficiency, clean technologies for all customers. And I do think the utility is the most efficient means for making that happen. And with that, I'll stop because I know we have other speakers and I'm eager to hear what they have to say, but we'll answer some questions.
Well, thank you very much for that. I think I'm going to start with a couple of disparate thoughts, and then sort of blend them together into something maybe slightly coherent. I think that what Ralph was saying is absolutely right, which is that we value what comes from electricity, not the electricity itself. I think that's also the case with many other things, though. And I think when you think about how the world has changed in the last 15 years, you could just point to the mobile phone. 1999, I was paying $25 a month for my phone service, and I thought, actually, very high quality phone service. Today, I pay $125 a month for what's actually very poor phone service, for those of you who know about it. But I'm not upset about it, right? I mean, I think for most of us, we're not upset about it because the computing power of the smartphone in my pocket is larger than the computing power of all the computers that put a man on the moon. And so I have received, at least in my own perception, more value for the money that I'm providing every month than I thought I was getting in 1999. If you take that forward to today, a good example of that would be the Nest thermostat. Today, the cheapest thermostat you can get in the marketplace is probably $20. And people are routinely paying $300 for a thermostat that looks cool on their wall. Something that Steve Jobs did very well in the past. But what does that provide you, right? I mean, I think when you think about it from a systemic point of view, because we're sort of laughing at some consumer items here, systemically, in the 1990s, led by Enron and supported by many others, we decided to provide flexibility to our grid using natural gas. And we added 400,000 megawatts of natural gas combined cycle plants and natural gas peaker plants. I think we all agree that that was actually a wholly inefficient way of doing things. It was okay when gas was $2.20 a million BTU, but today it's $4.71. For all this cheap shale gas that we have, it's actually more than double the cost it was in the 90s when we actually put it in. And so today, there are companies like AES and others who are saying that using all these thermostats and providing demand response to the grid is far cheaper than turning on a peaker plant, that we're paying a capacity payment to stay around to only run 30 or 40 or 50 hours per year. All of that metal, all of that gas capacity to run a plant 30, 40, 50, sometimes 70 hours a year. And in some cases, like the natural gas peaker plant in Berkeley, California, PG&E spends $39 million a year to keep it running and runs it less than 9 hours per year, right? So the challenge we have with our existing system is, I'm not an economist, I'm an engineer, but from an economics point of view, is that from a monopoly perspective, we've done the best job we can to make the system that we have today efficient. We've decided we're going to have central precision power plants, efficient power lines to take them to urban centers, a distribution grid to actually disperse that power and then to sell that power. From an entrepreneurial perspective, you have all of these innovations that John was referring to coming from the computer age, all the way through to material science and other things on the solar side. And the question becomes, what is the new model? I think most economists would agree that monopolies in general, just based on academic research, tends to stifle the growth of innovation within their field. And the utility is no exception. I think without exception, it has by far the lowest percentage of its revenue going to R&D expenses of any industry in the United States, and even a lower history of actually deploying the fruits of that small amount of R&D into the marketplace. And so we're stuck here today with these two opposing forces, and I think what Ralph was saying around the marketing piece is actually quite prescient. I think when you think about where we're going, if I'm a customer, Walmart's a very good one in the United States in the sense that it uses about 1% of all of the electricity in Texas, for instance. So a pretty large sort of user. And they're their own utility company in Texas. They bought a small sort of trading company, and so they actually trade their power directly in ERCOT. So an interesting example, I think, of what both John and Ralph were talking about. For them to allow the existing utility infrastructure to get the same earnings per share, to be able to maintain their share price, while Walmart itself is investing in solar panels for its roof, energy efficiency for its stores, demand response, load control, all of the other things, seems odd, right? I mean, unless you're actually getting so much additional value that you can continue to pay the premium necessary to maintain the earnings per share on the utility side while getting benefits for yourself, that there does seem to be some zero-sum game that'll come in there, right? And so for an industry like ours, where in the solar side we're spending $15 billion a year now in the United States, and that number will go to $30 billion in 2016. And then you couple that with, wind is sort of separate because it's really on the generation side only. But you think about all the other stuff from nest thermostats to energy efficiency to the things that are happening on the demand side of the meter, it's hard to see there being anything but a zero-sum game where somebody's earnings per share will go down and somebody else's earnings per share will go up. I think that when you think about the new regulatory policy, which is where this really comes down to, right? I think at the end of the day, the rules of the road are set by the regulator. They were set by the regulator in the case of the Federal Communications Commission for mobile phones and telephone service, and they'll be set again here by Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, as well as, in this case, probably more local state regulators. There's probably two principles we're going to follow. One, allowing as much innovation as possible to actually be used by their customers. Why? Because politically they have to. There's no way a governor or a state legislator or anyone else, for that matter, wants to deny themselves, let alone the rest of the consumers in the grid, access to these innovations, right? And so they're going to allow as many innovations as possible to be proliferated throughout the grid. And two, is now that we've reached an instability point because of this innovation, is how do you regain system efficiency, right? So in this new paradigm, how do you get back to a place of system efficiency in the most capital efficient way possible? Because you don't want rates to increase as much as they would if you solve the problem using 1.0 techniques, right? And so to me, I think that's the governing principle that we're under. And it's going to be something, in my opinion, that will lead to a far better place. And I do think that people will end up spending way more for electricity in the future voluntarily, which they're already doing, by the way. In New Jersey, there are thousands of customers that spend $25,000 for a backup generator in their backyard. And that's a lot of money compared to what they pay every month for electricity. So they're already willing to pay way more than they pay for electricity for reliability. And so I think that that future is coming. The same future where I spent $25 in 1999 and spend $125 a month now for my phone service will happen in electricity. But the question is it who's going to be allowed to get that revenue? And you know, from my perspective as an entrepreneur, obviously I want it to be me. For incumbents, it'll be a different question. And that fight will be a fight which I think will be of really, really interesting data on both sides. But I do think it's going to lead to a place that's better for everyone. Thanks.
So now David Newberry is our only panelist with a PowerPoint, and I invite my other panel members to join me in the audience so we can appreciate it.
Right, sorry for the delay. Now, I'm looking from a European perspective, and I should immediately say that I'm involved at the moment of redesigning two markets. One, GB, the electricity market reform. I'll sketch very briefly what we're doing. And in the island of Ireland, which has two countries, two currencies, but one single market, we are trying to adapt that rather well-designed market to the target electricity model. And both of these experiences have caused me to reconsider work that I did now 25 years ago on liberalizing markets and restructuring. So I want to talk a bit about what journey we've made, where we've come from, and why we can't carry on, or at least whether we can carry on with that old model. The European Union, along with most other countries who think about these, want to deliver secure, low-carbon electricity affordably. Those are the good things. But they want to do it in an unbundled, integrated across the whole of Europe, liberalised market. And that's where, of course, the challenge comes. So I'm going to question some of the credibility of the targets and the instruments that have been proposed. And in response to essentially that lack of credibility, different countries are having to make it up themselves. And I'll just talk briefly about Germany and UK as two salient examples. But they have to do that in the context of a single European market with trading between them. And that also creates interesting challenges. So the question I'm going to put, I'm not necessarily going to agree with it, is the time come for Europe to change the model that the UK was very prominent in promoting to a more US-style model. Okay, so that's the agenda. As I said, the UK, I think, was quite instrumental in influencing European policy. And we started off with the view that competition would deliver better, in particular state ownership. So the model, you're familiar with it, you unbundle generation and transmission, you privatize it, you provide incentive regulation for the bits that can't be competitive. And we did that in the UK in the context of cheap gas, lovely new technology which was low capital cost, combined cycle gas turbine, and an incumbent with old-fashioned coal, which was expensive. And so the liberalisation really did deliver a dramatic switch in fuel, in cost, in environmental consequences, and in lower prices to the consumer. Brilliant. Then, in the 2000, the environment changed in many senses, and people started becoming much more concerned about global climate change. And we would like, as economists, to price the externality, in this case carbon, but it doesn't do that well. The market hasn't done that. We would like to innovate. There's been a huge collapse as a result of liberalisation in research and development. And this is prompting, in many countries, a feeling that we need a new energy policy. The old one is no longer fit for purpose. And the problem we have is that we created a market to deliver competition, but we now have policy objectives that are not being delivered by the market, so there's a tension. And I'll illustrate this in the UK context. In a speech to this association, our Minister of Energy, as he then was before he became the Chancellor of the Exchequer, has said our task is rather to set a framework which will ensure that the market operates in the energy sector with minimum of distortion. Let markets work. Now that was conservative policy in this benign area of low gas prices and huge entry of new competitors into the market. Labour comes along and they're much more interventionist, so they want more objectives, but they're less coherent. So they want to protect the environment and equity. We've just heard the difficulty of taxing the rate-based consumers to pay for the Teslas and the PV panels on the rich people's roofs. Difficult. They wanted to protect coal. That's the traditional minor voting Labour base. But they also want to reduce carbon dioxide emissions. They want to lower the energy tax. They did. They reduced the value-added tax on energy to 5%. But they also wanted to pass on these environmental costs. And they wanted to keep independent regulators, but they wanted to give them much more guidance. So this was really a very fraught period in which essentially nothing happened that anybody could agree on. And eventually, partly because we have a coalition government, there is now a cross-party consensus, which is reflected in the Climate Change Act, and is reflected in cross-party support for the electricity market reform. And these are the objectives, the usual ones, and they're very much the European policy objectives. And let me remind you quickly that we have these two major instruments, the emissions trading system, which is supposed to price carbon, and a renewables directive that is supposed to stimulate the R&D, and in particular the demonstration and deployment that these new technologies, which are not yet commercially viable, need in order to drive down the costs. On top of that, the long-standing objective of the European Union is to integrate markets for everything, and in particular energy and electricity. The target is that by 2014 there should be complete unbundling. That's pretty much on track, and the markets should be coupled so that they are dispatched as a single market rather than lots of separate countries trading inefficiently across borders. We are progressing, but we are not yet there. The day-ahead market is working. The intraday and balancing markets are still work in progress. So, how well has these instruments worked? Well, this graph you've seen many times, and the only point I would like to make is that when the DG Climate that worries about the environment published its guidelines and saying, what do we want to do for 2030? We realised we've got a problem with carbon pricing, we want to backload, we want to stiffer future carbon targets. Did the market think that these were credible? Well, the price didn't move at all. so the markets go. This is market coupling. The idea is to make efficient use of all of the interconnectors, and in particular, instead of the national boundaries defining the price zones, the transmission congestion should determine where they are. That's still not fully implemented, but we are now making very considerable progress in that the green parts are the bits that are now simultaneously scheduled through the auction mechanism, and Britain joined in February this year. Ireland, what I'm particularly concerned with, is not going to join until 2016. It's such a different design, it's such a problematic, small, isolated system that they've been given extra time. But we've now got Southwest Europe coupled with Northwest Europe as of May this year. So the day-ahead market coupling for these interconnectors is on track. Security of supply, well, the problem, as we've heard in many interesting presentations, is that all of these renewable targets, which are very ambitious, have had quite a dramatic and negative impact from the existing incumbent utilities' point of view of lowering the price. And in particular, whereas it may take you several years to establish a wind farm, if you put in such a generous price for PV, you can bring up the local people and they'll come and screw it on your roof remarkably fast. So the government can suddenly find that it's seriously several billions of pounds in hop as a result of announcing a rather generous price. We have a very malign combination from the utilities' point of view, the incumbent utilities, in that we've got high gas prices, not like lucky you, because of Fukushima driving up the LNG prices. We've got the cheap coal that you no longer like and export to us, and so that's crashed the coal price. So the clean spark spread is negative in many countries. It's unprofitable to build gas turbines. It's profitable to run your coal stations flat out. So in terms of meeting our carbon targets, this is not the best combination. And we also, in some countries, have limitations on how long the coal can continue to operate without massive changes. And that is putting a threat to investing in coal. So you have this strange situation that it's not attractive to invest in gas, and it looks pretty dangerous to invest in coal, and so people tend to sit on their hands in such cases. And even more, they know that the future price of electricity is much more subject to policies that are still being argued out in the parliaments around Europe. So things like what's going to happen to the carbon price are crucial for the question of coal versus gas. How much renewable we will have to put on the system at the price, and also the attractiveness of investment in that. And what happens in neighbouring countries like Germany impacts in this integrated market on what happens everywhere else. So it's really quite difficult to justify investing in the things that are needed to deliver the security of supply. Let me just point out the dramatic rise in wind capacity this is in Germany, Spain, increasingly in UK. We're gradually shaping up. We're supposed to reach the German 2013 targets by 2020, but that only has a 20% capacity factor, which means that every now and again, 4 times as much as the average is going to be on the system. If you look at PV, again, dramatic growth, that's running at 10% average capacity, which means you may have 10 times as much as in some sense you need at certain hours of the day. So the impact of this at certain hours on the system is very dramatic. And the system has to cope with that and also finance the mechanisms for coping with that. Here's a rather, and Gail will leap up and say, no, it's not like this at all, but this is my take on what Germany is doing. So they don't like nuclear power, they want to appear green, so they go for massive renewables, and that's crashed the price spread so that they actually undermine the gas, which would have replaced the coal, So they're locking in coal investment in plants that will be there for the next 60 years, and that doesn't seem like a very green thing to do. The cost of doing the renewables is pretty impressive. We're lucky, Germany's really rich, and so they can pay for driving down the cost of PV and developing better wind turbines. They've got a problem with industry paying and they've managed to sidestep some of that with some rather nifty footwork with DG Comp on state aids. But the question I think they will have to face is, do they need some mechanism to ensure security of supply and to deal with all of this volatility on their market? So this is a build-up of the retail domestic price, and it shows that the wholesale price, the blue bit at the bottom, by the way, varies quite a lot across the country, as does the network costs. There are huge variations in that. But the fun parts are the taxes, and you can see in Germany they have really, really cheap wholesale power, but they have really, really expensive charges to pay for it. And so consequently, whereas they might have been one of the cheapest countries in some sense on the energy front, they're the second most expensive on the retail front, outdone by Denmark. GB has pretty expensive basic stuff, but we have very low taxes, although they're building up pretty rapidly. So, when we come to Britain, we passed the Energy Act quite recently. We have attempted to address some of the particular problems I've mentioned. And in order to do that, the security we're addressing through capacity payments, and I'll talk a bit about that. The fact that we don't trust the emissions trading system is that we